Ya. Bueno, y la presentación. Y después puedo con esto ir animando, ¿no?
No, con este.
Ah, ya.
Sí, esa es mentira. ¿Aquí?
Sí.
Ya. Ya. Gracias a todos y todas por estar aquí con nosotros. Muy bienvenidos de nuevo. Ahora vamos a empezar con una mesa sobre cuidados, diversificación de las prácticas de cuidado. Y para empezar tenemos la doctora Carolina Ramírez, quien es académica de la Universidad Católica de Silva Enríquez y es socióloga de Goldsmith College, una socióloga visual. Entonces, muy bienvenida a Carolina. También es investigadora de COE.
Sí, adjunta.
Gracias, Carolina.
Ya, súper. Muchas gracias, Carol, por la presentación y gracias también por organizar este evento. Estoy súper contenta de compartir estas ideas relativamente iniciales con ustedes. Este es un trabajo que tomé, dejé y ahora estoy como retomando, tratando de seguir elaborando algunas ideas. Mi licenciatura se titula Cuidados vecinales y articulaciones socioespaciales en zonas urbanas diversas, experiencias migrantes durante el COVID-19. Quería partir con las palabras de una de mis participantes, que me he llamado Mariana. Ella es una vecina peruana quien conocí en la Plaza Basile antes de la pandemia, cuando ella estaba vendiendo productos en la plaza como vendedora ambulante. En una segunda conversación que sostuvimos 3 meses de iniciar la estricta medida de confinamiento, ella describía el inicio de la pandemia como un cambio rotundo que había sido, dice, un estrés total. O sea, agradezco que estamos sanos, pero igual un cambio total, pues, ¿no? Se ve un poco de tristeza de ver que la plaza, que últimamente se llenaba tanto de gente, de visitas, desapareció todo eso. Hubo bastante cambio y tristeza. No puedo sacar a mi hijo a pasear ni nada. Hubo un cambio total, un cambio de ambiente total. Es un estrés también para muchos, ¿ya? Y eso se articula como con una especie de atmósfera afectiva, ¿no? Basada en la incertidumbre que era particularmente común entre mis entrevistados. Y que dan cuenta, ¿cierto? Y esta es la noción que quiero capturar de lo que denomino como un momento crítico compartido, ¿ya? Que a diferencia del momento crítico que escribe, por ejemplo, Carajan, que es esta idea de conllevar una actitud de aguante, una forma de sobrevivir en silencio, en medio de la inestabilidad y la precariedad, estos momentos críticos compartidos giran, como dice Tictín, nuestra atención hacia las dinámicas de cuidado activadas en el espacio público, para la supervivencia colectiva, particularmente en situaciones de incertidumbre donde el miedo, la ansiedad y la frustración son ampliamente compartidos. Desde este escenario de un contexto de crítico compartido, quiero presentar algunas nociones con las que aquí dialogo. Bueno, una es la noción de convivencia, se trata de ver los cuidados como una dinámica de convivencia en contextos crecientemente diversos y en situaciones de crisis, ¿no? La convivencia, y particularmente en situaciones de crisis, de diversidad, tiene significado y dinámicas ambivalentes, ¿no? Pudiendo generar como respuesta nuevas formas de tensiones y de conflicto, pero también nuevas formas de colaboración y solidaridad. Y me quiero centrar particularmente en esto último, en lo que Katy Datelu denomina formas de socialidad positiva, ¿ya? Las cuales no obstante pueden emerger de formas compartidas, de precariedad, o emergentes formas, ¿no? de incertidumbre y todas la agudización de persistentes formas de precarización, etc. Y acá me quiero centrar, bueno, en esta forma de sociabilidad y las dinámicas de cuidado, ¿ya? Y tomando esta idea, ¿no?, que decía Nicole la mañana, de que los cuidados pueden tomar distintas formas en distintos contextos, distintos sitios. Aquí me apoyo de la definición de Catarabellu, que ve cuidados como un set de redes, relaciones, lógicas y actos que expresan solidaridades, conexiones e interacciones cotidianas e informales. Pueden involucrar lazos fuertes y también débiles de amistad y también relaciones mucho más difusas, ¿ya? Entonces, tiene más sintonía con esta dimensión más cotidiana y mundana, ¿cierto?, en la relación de cuidados en territorios particulares. Ahora, ¿por qué cuidados vecinales? Y acá, bueno, hay varios motivos, unos que, como señala Vega Solís, porque en lugar de cuidados comunitarios, ¿no? Primero, no voy a elaborar la discusión, pero porque los cuidados vecinales, si bien pueden constituirse en base a problemáticas comunes, no siempre dan origen a la formación de comunidades. Además, quería alejarme de esta noción de community care, que se vinculó tradicionalmente al voluntariado y medidas asistencialistas, ¿no? De alguna manera que acentuaban la dependencia, el aislamiento y la sobrecarga femenina, dejando menos espacio para ver los cuidados como formas de subversión o transformación social. También hablar de cuidados vecinales nos permite dar un giro a la dimensión local y colectiva en la interfaz migración-cuidados, en un contexto donde los cuidados en la experiencia migratoria han sido sobre todo abordados en la dimensión transnacional, ¿cierto? Y también en el contexto doméstico a través del trabajo remunerado. Y por último, lo vecinal también, esto es importante en el contexto de la migración, ¿cierto? Nos permite superar el enfoque étnico-comunitario centrado en el análisis, centrándonos más bien en el análisis de relaciones, conexiones y redes que se configuran entre personas diversas y a través de los límites barriales. Ahora, esto de a través de los límites barriales es importante acá, puesto que yo me centro en una zona, que es la zona nororiente de la comuna de Santiago, que se denomina el Gran Yungay, que es un conjunto de barrios. Brasil, Conchaitoro, Balmaceda y Yungay. Esto es un barrio, como muchos de ustedes ya sabrán y lo conocerán, otros no, con una larga trayectoria de asentamiento migrante, un barrio muy diverso, y también con una importante trayectoria de organización vecinal, que se puede encontrar, de hecho, caminando por las paredes, impresos, ¿cierto?, en el arte urbano del lugar. Además tiene algunas problemáticas bien conocidas, como subarriendo abusivo, hacinamiento, estigmatización e inseguridad. En este contexto llevé a cabo sesiones de observación participante, que se vieron un poco interrumpidas por la pandemia, por la medida de confinamiento. También entrevistas en profundidad, tanto presenciales como remotas, con algunas follow-up interviews. También algunas técnicas visuales participativas como fotos. Perdón si voy un poco rápido, pero como tengo 15 minutos, como el papel. Me quiero centrar en tres, no sé si ejes de análisis o situaciones que siento expresan esta idea de cuidados vecinales.
Compartido, perdón.
Bueno, decía, son tres, que descansan en forma que descansan en formas de cuidado, ¿no?, que nos señalan la reinvención y apertura de solidaridades activas, es decir, dinámicas de solidaridad que ya existían en el barrio y que voy a ejemplificar a través de una agrupación de mujeres migrantes organizadas. También dinámicas que nos hablan de formas de habitar, de la imbricación entre formas de habitar, cuidar y ser o no sujetos legítimos de cuidado. Y en tercer lugar, también dinámicas de contención social a través de formas híbridas de convivencia, ¿no? Y aquí lo trae a la mesa el uso de las tecnologías de la interacción, como las denomina Catirabelli también. Al mirar estas tres dinámicas, lo que vemos son formas de articulación social a través del cuidado en contextos crecientemente diferenciados y permeados por contextos de crisis. Y específicamente quiero aproximar el cuidado aquí entonces como forma de solidaridad, apoyo mutuo y contención. Primero, en relación con la reinvención y apertura de solidaridades, quiero traer a la mesa entonces este caso de mujeres migrantes latinoamericanas. Es un grupo de mujeres migrantes latinoamericanas que se conformó el 2011, luego del terremoto, ¿no?, como una manera de poder postular a una vivienda. Ese fue un motor inicial que no obstante se vio desplazado con el tiempo por las dificultades que tuvieron, pero se mantiene como colectivo, ¿ya? Es un grupo compuesto por mujeres de distintas nacionalidades, ahí brasileños, chilenos, peruanos, bolivianos, todos pueden participar en una integración migrante, ¿ya? Son mujeres que han sido muy activas y son relativamente conocidas en el barrio, a través de postulación de fondos municipales, de eventos locales, actividades para reunir dinero. y también dan de manera informal orientación a otras personas migrantes para la realización de trámites formales e informales. Durante la pandemia pudimos ver cómo ellas adaptaron sus iniciativas vecinales. Lo que primaba era un discurso de que ellas no estaban activas, ¿no? Como que terminamos de funcionar como comunidad, pero lo que podíamos ver más bien era una adaptación a estas actividades, junto con la comunicación y monitoreo de sus miembros permanentes, ¿no? Para saber cómo estaban, si están enfrentando alguna dificultad económica, puesto que sabemos que la pandemia también tuvo un importante impacto en su situación laboral. También se desarrollaron nuevas iniciativas dirigidas al contexto local, más amplio, repartición de alimentos, poner a disposición hornos industriales que habían adquirido a través de fondos municipales. Y bueno, aquí hay algún ejemplo, algunas citas de las actividades que llevan a cabo, también fotografías que compartieron conmigo. Y lo que quiero traer aquí a la mesa entonces es el dinamismo, ¿no?, de este tipo de solidaridades activas llevadas a cabo por lo que ella misma denomina una comunidad, y cómo se amplía, ¿cierto?, a un espectro más amplio, en este caso el espectro más vecinal, personas chilenas y personas que están fuera de esta comunidad. También al ser personas que, y esto es interesante también, que han residido en distintos barrios de Yungay, a través de estas prácticas también ellas se extienden, ¿no?, a una dinámica vecinal que expande esos límites barriales que normalmente se usan para definir este espacio, la dinámica que tiene lugar en este espacio. Además trae a la mesa el rol de mujeres largamente asentadas, ¿no?, y nos hace preguntar quiénes están en una mejor posición, ¿cierto?, para cuidar dentro de estos territorios, para dar cuidado y quizás ciertas jerarquías que allí operan. Y por cierto, como es común, también nos permite ver la implicación entre dinámicas socioafectivas y materiales. Otra dinámica interesante tiene que ver con estas formas de habitar, cuidar y ser sujetos legítimos de cuidado. Y aquí lo que veíamos era cómo distintas personas incorporaban en sus rutinas cotidianas prácticas anónimas de cuidado, basadas, por ejemplo, a pesar de sus propias carencias, ¿no?, muchas personas migrantes, en la repartición de alimentos que ellas preparaban individualmente, repartiendo, por ejemplo, a gente en situación de calle. Y aquí surgían controversias interesantes, ¿no? Un poco refleja esta cita que está acá, ¿no?, que vea de que la plaza está tomada por personas que no son vecinos, y se generaban ciertas controversias. Y aquí aparecían las personas en situación de calle, ¿cierto?, como sujetos que no eran considerados por todos como sujetos legítimos de cuidado, ¿ya? Y se generaba esta idea de que la persona lograba tener una mayor legitimidad en el cuidado, en la medida que también entregaba una forma de retribución, ¿no? Las personas que cuidaban autos, que cuidaban casas, por ejemplo, lograban tener un mayor reconocimiento como sujetos legítimos de cuidado. Algo que aquí parecía también como interesante, si pensamos el punto de vista de las personas migrantes, era cómo se generaba entre ellas, ¿no?, una mayor suerte de empatía y mayor apertura, disposición a cuidar frente a estas formas ilegítimas de habitar, puesto que también ellas rememoraban sus propias experiencias de vivir de allegado y sin techo, ¿no?, que se vio como muy patente durante la pandemia, ¿no? Entonces, de reconocerse a sí misma en estas formas ilegítimas de habitar la ciudad, ¿ya? O sea, alguna manera de traer consigo esta experiencia que han sido invisibilizadas por estas narrativas de una integración exitosa, en el caso de algunas migrantes, se veía como se traía a la mesa nuevamente. También se vieron estas otras formas de ayuda, o podemos ahí ver, discutir un poco cómo lo estamos conceptualizando, pero formas anónimas, ¿no?, de ayudar y proveer, de aprovisionamiento, como estas cajas de acopio, que creo que es algo que se dio en distintas partes, ¿no? Donde tiene la particularidad, primero, de situarse en lugares donde convergen y cruzan habitualmente personas de distintos barrios, pues también genera esta articulación vecinal, pero también son recursos que cualquiera puede compartir anónimamente, tener que dar razones, diría Tictín, o mostrar merecimiento, ¿ya? Y eso es particularmente importante si consideramos que son mecanismos de provisión, ¿no? Ahí se alcanza a ver esta típica idea de si tiene, deje, si no tiene, saque, ¿no? Como que esa era la dinámica. Son dinámicas basadas en anonimato que además no establecen distinciones entre quienes son o no sujetos legítimos de cuidado. Se cobran también, ¿cierto?, un cariz particular. En tercer lugar, y podríamos discutir si cada una de estas dinámicas podría ser una discusión en sí misma, pero me parece interesante ver estas dinámicas de contención también como formas de cuidado, especialmente a través de formas híbridas de convivencia. ¿Ya? Hay algunas citas que reflejan aquello, ¿no? Lidia, por ejemplo, una mujer brasilera de 30 años, decía: ahora como el mundo es virtual, más que nada siento que el contacto por WhatsApp, en este caso, es como una contención, ¿sí? Si alguien necesita alguna ayuda, si ha pasado algo, es como una pánico. Hernán también nos decía: es muy grato tener este espacio con los vecinos que sirve tanto de coordinación como de contención. Entonces aquí aparece el uso de estas redes como una forma de contención que es tanto frente a una situación de inestabilidad, nuevamente, que es compartida, ¿sí? Y que es también, sobre todo emocional, ¿ya? Es importante tener esto en cuenta en un contexto de distanciamiento. Aquí quiero citar el artículo de Carol y Rosario, recientemente publicado, donde ellas nos hablan de esta idea de contención que implica un espacio proporcionado por otro, que permite la expresión libre y segura de los sentimientos potencialmente explosivos, un refugio donde uno podría encontrar liberación emocional y validación. Está traducido al español. Lo interesante es cómo esto también puede tomar distintas formas, ¿no? Y constituirse, en este caso, virtualmente como un espacio de acompañamiento. Bueno, hay distintos tipos de agrupaciones, ¿cierto? Particularmente importantes fueron las agrupaciones de mujeres que surgieron en el barrio en este contexto. Y es interesante pensar en estos espacios de cuidado, ¿cierto? Como algo que Catirabello denomina espacios cívicos, que tienen un alto grado de autonomía de los intereses estatales, comerciales y de inclusión al estar abierto a personas de todos los ámbitos de la vida. Entonces, nuevamente pensando en la importancia que cobran estos espacios en un contexto de diversificación, ¿no?, generado por la migración, ¿no?, la posibilidad de reunir a personas muy diversas. A modo de cierre y de discusión, quiero traer a la mesa cómo estas dinámicas, ¿no?, que parecen ser más bien, cuando yo las describo del contexto de la pandemia, bueno, ahí se desplegaron y desde ahí las analicé. Pero es interesante pensar cómo estas formas que hoy perduran, ¿no?, yo sigo haciendo un poco de trabajo de campo en esta zona, que trascienden este hito en particular, ¿no?, y llegan a transformar las formas de vincularse a nivel cotidiano, ¿no? Muchos de estos grupos de WhatsApp, o muchas de estas dinámicas de vincularse con el entorno, de alguna manera llegaron para quedarse, ¿no? Entonces, mirar estas dinámicas de convivencia en contextos de crisis nos permite también, de alguna manera, apreciar el dinamismo, ¿cierto?, de estas dinámicas de cuidado. Por cierto, es importante ir más allá de una mirada idílica y problematizar ciertos elementos que quizá aquí podemos dejar para la discusión, ¿no? Pensar cómo estas dinámicas emergen frente a un Estado que nos cuida, o frente al hecho que la micropolítica de los cuidados tiene una velocidad, el diferencial de velocidades entre esa ayuda y la ayuda que provee el Estado, por ejemplo, ¿no? Entonces ahí también pensar en las bases que dan origen a aquello. Por cierto, cómo se mantienen ciertas relaciones, ciertas jerarquías en relación con quién cuida, ¿no? Donde tiempo de residencia, género, edad, se reparten, ¿no?, distintamente estas labores de cuidado. También pensar en la posicionalidad de capitales de los migrantes, no es solamente lo que debemos atender a aquellos, sino que también en las trayectorias de diversidad de los lugares, en las redes y solidaridades activas que allí existen, para poder comprender, ¿cierto?, las dinámicas de cuidados que son allí posibles en contexto de crisis. Y por último, bueno, más basado en el último punto, pero pensar en las tecnologías de interacción como nuevas formas o emergentes formas que cobran más relevancia como formas de articulación social, vecinal, y como inseparable además de dinámicas presenciales. Eso, muchas gracias.
Gracias, Carolina. Ahora vamos a invitar a la doctora Megan Rayburn, que es doctora en Geografía Humana de la Universidad Queen Mary University of London. La Megan es postdoctorante del Latin American Caribbean Center del London School of Economics. Y también es autora de Uncertain Citizenship, una etnología sobre migrantes de Bolivia en Chile. Gracias, Megan. Gracias, ¿me escuchan bien? Sí. Ya. Voy a dar la presentación en inglés, pero súper bienvenidas preguntas en español o en inglés después. So, navigating borderlands, Colombian migrant women in Antofagasta, Chile, and experiences of violence, is a British Academy-funded postdoctoral project that began in 2018 and will conclude at the end of this year. Approximately 16% of the Antofagasta region's population of just over 600,000 are migrants, of whom around 80% have arrived since 2010. After Bolivians, this is according to statistics I think taken from 2020 to 2021, so this may have changed, but after Bolivians, Colombians are the second largest group by nationality, and most Colombians in Antofagasta come from the Pacific Coast region. Whilst their reasons for migrating are mixed and complex, the armed conflict and its multiple repercussions often form part of the complex matrix of motivations for migration, even if they are not, and in many cases they are not able to, for various reasons, to seek official sort of refugee status. Once you start to talk to people, you unpick the reasons for migration, and the context of violence in Colombia may well form a part of it. So this project investigates Colombian migrant women's experiences of indirect and direct violence across borders and the practices engaged to navigate these experiences. It combines multi-sited ethnography in Antofagasta, the Pacific Coast region of Colombia, and on the overland bus journey between the two, with collaborative art-based methods, including a co-produced animated short film and an exposition of narrative apilleras, which are embroidered appliqué wall hangings, which we are currently co-creating. Over the past 4.5 years, I've carried out a total of 7 months of in-person fieldwork, keeping in touch with many of my participants via WhatsApp as well when not there in person. So triangulating the different perspectives afforded by each method has enabled the conceptual thinking that undergirds the book manuscript I'm currently writing, of which some of this analysis will form a part. I don't have the scope to go into detail, but in the book, conceptually, I draw particularly on the scholarship of feminist geographers such as Caroline Farrier, Cindy Katz, Kathy McElwain, Alison Mounts, Rachel Payne, Melissa Wright, and Saragosin and Martina Garreta, as well as anthropologist Enric Big. I theorize the violent topography of the borderland, which is an imagined borderland with material effects, as simultaneously produced in and through the body, the home, the workplace, and the nation state. Women must navigate this violent topography daily through agile and adaptive practices. I demonstrate how counter topographies of aguante and of alegría, which I loosely translate as endurance and joy, are generated through their navigation practices over time. I began to understand the numerous migrant-run nail and beauty salons in downtown Antofagasta as places where this borderland space is constructed and navigated every day in unextraordinary ways. I conducted extensive participant observation here in 2019 and early 2020 in this Colombian-owned and run salon, which I call Casa Diana. This is a pseudonym, as are all the names I'm using. I've also recently returned to the salon, but my recent visits don't form part of these reflections, but do feel free to ask me about them in the Q&A. So in 2019, when I began this fieldwork, the salon manager installed me with my own chair, where I perched with a strategic view of comings and goings at busy times of day. In quieter moments, I spoke with the 10 manicurists, the majority of whom were from Colombia, from the Pacific Coast region.
Around half of them identified as Afro-Colombian, including the salon manager and owner, and half identified as mestizo. So the salon sits on a busy street corner. When I was carrying out ethnography, the doors were always open to a flow of customers, with the pace picking up around lunchtime and in the early evening. The decor was tired and in need of renovation, but Casa Diana visually sold a hyper-feminized, racialized idea of beauty. Customers were invited to sit in bubblegum pink throne-like chairs, from which they could see images of Marilyn Monroe, the Eiffel Tower, and manicured white and light-skinned black hands. Prices were pitched slightly above the bottom of the manicure market, but well below the high-end manicures offered by spa salons in the south of Antofagasta. Customers were very diverse because this is such a central location, ranging from municipal cleaners to lawyers to school and university students to full-time moms. Around 2/3 were Chilean, and of the rest, most customers were Colombian. So in the salon, one did not witness the explicit violence present in other places where the borderland is formed. It was not the shocking racist aggression of the border crossing that I have witnessed and been told about, nor that of the killings and death threats that have forced some participants to flee Colombia fearing for their lives. While stories of these events did creep into the salon via the conversations of the manicurists, in the salon, a violent topography, which belies the pink decor and the cultivation of feminine beauty that I'm deliberately representing in these images, built up through the sedimentation of excessive hours, low wages, the effects of harmful chemicals on manicurists' bodies, and through the repetition of microaggressions. So the manicurists worked and still do from 10 a.m. to 9 p.m. Most work 6, sometimes 7 days a week. They had, and this is a contrast with what's happening now, so that's something I can talk about later. They had contracts that guaranteed them the minimum wage each month, which was, I think, 350,000 Chilean pesos in 2019, which is about 420 US dollars, I think. And then they earned a percentage of each treatment that they did that was over this amount. And by operating in this way, the business saves money on taxes because they only have to pay tax on the minimum contract amount. And there's a really great article by Rosario Palacios that examines the different ways in Chilean beauty salons operate in terms of employment conditions. And this is one of the modes of operation. So in terms of where they lived, most manicurists at Casa Diana rent a cramped single room with a shared kitchen and bathroom with cold water only, although some also live in the campamentos, so informal settlements. The manicure work itself is tiring, and it takes a significant physical toll. Most noticeably, they commented on their backs and hands. Their skin was often raw as well and damaged from the constant use of chemicals. None wore gloves, and pre-COVID, none wore masks. There is clear evidence that frequent exposure to the chemicals used in nail salons significantly increases the risk of cancer as well as other diseases over the life course. So while the manicurists' working and living conditions were not at the most extreme end of the spectrum of labor exploitation, which I think we'll be hearing a bit more about later, this type of labor in a highly gendered, classed, and racialized niche can be economically insecure and very wearing on workers' bodies. And this very much chimes with the findings of other researchers on what has been termed body work or body labor. That is the employment that involves embodied touch and both physical and emotional labor, as well as some of the other types of labor that Nicole so eloquently outlined in her presentation before. So in addition to these relatively poor labor conditions at Casa Diana, multiple acts of discrimination hinging on nationality and race amass over time. And I'm going to give just one illustrative example. So a Chilean woman, her hair in a tight ponytail, came in wanting to see her regular Colombian manicurist, whom I'm going to call Sandra, who identified as mestiza. The customer rudely demanded that Sandra fix a couple of her acrylic nails. Sandra was in the middle of another booking, and so she couldn't help, but placatingly referring to the customer as Princesa, suggested that she got her nail fixed with Lena, who was another manicurist and also the salon manager. At this moment, Lena was out the back, so Sandra indicated to the customer where to sit down to wait. Lena, who, as I mentioned before, is Afro-Colombian, returned and sat down opposite the customer. She gently took her hand and asked a couple of questions about her nails, politely using the formal usted. Suddenly, the customer snatched her hand away from Lena, pushed her chair back forcefully, and shouted, "Tú no entiendes nada." You don't understand anything, using the informal tú, before turning on her heel and marching out of the salon. There was a shocked pause, and then we all looked at one another and laughed in disbelief and discomfort. Lena was visibly taken aback by the encounter. She reenacted what had happened, emphasizing the woman's very aggressive facial expression. "¿Qué le pasa?" everyone explained, sympathizing, although there was this shared unspoken understanding that it was racism that was what was happening here. So whilst all the Colombian manicurists experienced discrimination on a more or less daily basis in different forms, it was undoubtedly most acute for those who were Afro-Colombian. There were hierarchies of race and class internal to the salon as well, with some of the manicurists experiencing discrimination from their colleagues. In particular, one of the women, who I'll call Lydia, was subtly bullied and ostracized. Although all the Colombians working in the salon were from the Pacific Coast region, the owner, salon manager, and most of the manicurists were from Cali or nearby towns such as Palmira. Lydia was from the port city of Buenaventura. It is majority Afro-Colombian, and in Colombia is often stigmatized as being dangerous and backwards. In Antofagasta, Lydia lived in a campamento, which was also stigmatized by those manicurists who rented private rooms. In the salon, I heard other manicurists within earshot of Lydia refer to people from Buenaventura as ignorantes, ignorant, speak poorly of those who lived in campamentos, and deliberately exclude Lydia from conversations. These are some stills taken from our animated film. I'm going to show the next images. So in this context, where the boundaries of the borderland are constantly being reinforced, women find ways to aguantar, this is a polyvalent verb, which I translate the ease as endure, but it is used frequently by participants across my research. It may indicate simply coping or carrying on, but it can also connote not resistance per se, but rather a kind of quiet defiance, a refusal to desist and disappear. For the manicurists, it was through enduring the constant repetition of what I term transactions of care that they managed to earn enough to get by and sometimes to save and send money home. These transactions between manicurists and customers are predicated on and reproduce structures of race, class, and gender through verbal interactions, as well as through the materiality of nail art design. And this is something that Milian Kang, in her 2003 study, which I still think remains a brilliant piece of work, she puts in her outstanding analysis of race, class, and gender in US nail salons. And I quote here, she says, "The gendered processes of physical and emotional labor in nail salon work are steeped with race and class meanings that reinforce broader structures of inequality and ideologies of difference between women," close quote. And this was certainly reflected in Casa Diana. Manicurists comprehended, expected, and played an active role in maintaining these race and class-based distinctions. So I'm going to have to sort of simplify this down because we've got limited time. But in material terms, we could say that middle-class Chilean women tended to choose a single color from a muted palette, request a more simple nail art design on their ring finger, or choose just a simple color effect. By contrast, Colombian women, and in particular Afro-Colombian women, as well as more working-class Chilean women, wore their nails longer, were more likely to use acrylics, and showcased much more elaborate nail art designs. And the manicurists knew and expected this. As they completed the physical labor of these transactions, they also performed different types of emotional labor depending on how they read their client's race and class position. So whilst they were likely, because of the sort of cultural difference between Colombia and Chile, to use the formal usted with all of their customers, they tended to use fewer terms of endearment such as mi amor and mami with middle-class Chilean customers, and the care transaction was more distanced. But it was often, and although not exclusively, in the process of completing the more elaborate designs that the manicurist-customer relationship shifted away from something more transactional, more towards a practice of a different kind of care, from manicurist to customer. To give one example, Daniela, an Afro-Colombian manicurist from Cali, was painting the nails of a Chilean woman in her 30s, a bright orange with an elaborate French tip and diamante design on her second and fourth finger. So quite an elaborate design. Sandra, one of the other manicurists, leaned across and asked the customer, "How's your baby?" The customer, pleased to be asked, responded to say that her baby was now home. And prompted, she told them more about her baby's hospital stay and how hard things were. "Le ha tocado durísimo, no? You've had such a hard time, haven't you?" sympathized Sandra. The emotional labor involved in these types of one-directional conversations with the manicurist as empathetic listener seemed to have a cathartic value, which has been commented in many other contexts, that went well beyond the nail care transaction. And whilst there were, and it's important not to forget, these divisions and hierarchies within the salon, as I described amongst the staff, the manicurists did also engage in practices of physical care for one another. They would do each other's nails, fix braids and weaves, put in eye drops, and there was a gentleness and intimacy different in these acts from the affect of the care they provided for customers. They also listened and shared problems as they ate typical Colombian snacks, like fruit salad with cheese, cocadas, arroz con leche, that they bought from the ambulant street vendors who passed through the salon. Sometimes, in the enactment of these practices of care, a moment of what I'm thinking of as ephemeral compassion and joy emerged. One quiet afternoon, Santiago, the only male manicurist who is Colombian and identifies as queer, set to making a video for Instagram of a rainbow design that he painted on Daniela's nails, so one of the other manicurists. And the others enthusiastically commented on his work, and there was suddenly this buoyant and elated mood in the salon. On other occasions, shared experiences of motherhood were often at the root of these practices of care that sometimes spilled over into joy. The majority of the manicurists were mothers, some with children in Chile and others with children still in Colombia. So Mother's Day, for example, was celebrated with great enthusiasm, with artificial roses and small stuffed toys gifted to all the manicurists who were mothers. They laughed and joked about their experiences of maternity, playing music that one described as música vieja y romántica que a todas las mamás nos gusta, old romantic music which all of us mums like. A month or so later, when Daniela discovered she was 4 months pregnant with her first child and told her colleagues, everyone was extremely excited. Some weeks after that, she came to the salon laden with bags full of pink baby clothes. And they were eagerly inspected with exclamations over how sweet everything was and reminiscences about the manicurist's own babies. As Daniela pulled out little gloves she had purchased, another manicurist joked, and with this real affection and care, "Pero por qué compraste tantas weas?" Like, why did you buy so much rubbish? And everyone collapsed in this joyful laughter. So inevitably, in 15 minutes, I can only give the very briefest sketch of salon life, and there's a lot more I would love to unpack. I'm particularly aware that I haven't been able to reflect on my own positionality within the salon, which was, as you can imagine, very complex. But I hope I've provided enough to open a conversation about how care and bodywork employment in Chile is race, class, and gendered, and how this links to these wider discussions around migration and care. And I wanted to conclude by commenting that somewhat unexpectedly, this is in many ways the hardest part of my current research to present and analyze. I ask myself, why does what happens in a nail salon matter compared with the horror and distress of the extreme borderland violence of which I've become aware through the other methodological foci of the project? And in answer, I must remind myself that it's deeply interconnected, that the labor conditions and small acts of discrimination that occur in a nail salon contribute to the formation of that same violent topography that migrant women must navigate every day as they endure and then sometimes find these moments of joy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. So I'm going to, it's Carol speaking, and I'm going to receive questions from the audience online and as well as audience in the room. Francisca has a question.
Hola, buenos días. Tengo una pregunta para Carolina en relación a un poco esta concepción del cuidado.
Para que puedan escuchar la pregunta.
En relación a esta caracterización del cuidado en la agrupación de mujeres latinoamericanas, si pudiste evidenciar diferentes concepciones culturales de esa noción de cuidado. Te lo pregunto porque yo estoy ahora empezando a hacer una investigación sobre migración haitiana en la estación central y Filosofía, que es sobre espacio doméstico, no sobre cuidado. Pero a propósito de eso, en relación a los haitianas y los haitianos en particular, al abordar el tema del espacio doméstico, de la vida doméstica, inevitablemente aparece el tema del cuidado, entendido como lo definiste tú en relación a estas redes, ¿no? Y culturalmente su concepción de esa vida barrial, ¿no es cierto?, vecinal que tú describes, cuando preguntamos sobre cómo es esa vida allá y cómo es acá, cómo se resignifica acá todas esas redes, esas relaciones, hay como una dificultad bien compleja porque hay una concepción muy distinta en el caso de los haitianos en particular con respecto a esta vida cotidiana y lo colectivo. Por ejemplo, porque una cuestión bien particular, ellos al hablar sobre la cocina como un espacio importante, para ellos la cocina es un espacio, bueno, primero que está situado fuera de la casa, porque cocinar a carbón, qué sé yo, pero sobre todo porque el acto de cocinar es un acto colectivo, siempre, no para la pandemia, no para una cuestión en particular, sino que siempre es así. Entonces ellos siempre tienen que tener café y pan, por ejemplo, o algo de comer para el vecino que no toca la puerta de la casa, sino que solamente entra y tiene acceso permanente a ese espacio, tiene llaves. Cuando yo le pregunté, bueno, ¿y esto cómo se hace acá? Porque si bien acá existen evidentemente los sectores populares, redes particulares de solidaridad que se activan bajo ciertas circunstancias, en el caso de los haitianos ella planteaba que lo resuelven más entre haitianos porque hay dificultades para poder permear, digamos, esas fronteras. Entonces la pregunta tiene que ver con si la distinción cultural de estas convenciones del cuidado son observables, digamos, en este ámbito en el que tú estás analizando.
Gracias. Vamos a tomar más preguntas, juntar preguntas. ¿Alguien más tiene preguntas? Comentarios y ya. María Liz, te voy a dar la palabra.
Gracias, Carol. Bueno, primero felicitar a las compañeras, súper interesantes ambas ponencias. Mi primera pregunta es para Carolina. Quería preguntarte, si bien entiendo que el foco de tu ponencia y de tu investigación no tiene que ver con las cuestiones de diferenciación étnica o nacional, pero sí me produce mucha curiosidad si se quiere, el perfil demográfico del barrio donde vos llevaste a cabo tu trabajo de campo, o sea, de dónde vienen, o sea, de qué países vienen estas mujeres migrantes que llevan a cabo trabajo de cuidado vecinal. En un momento vos hablaste de que eran, o sea, asentamientos de larga data, de comunidades migrantes, entonces quisiera saber, o sea, un poco más sobre cuáles son las comunidades migrantes que conforman digamos, el mapa, si se quiere, demográfico del barrio. Eso por un lado, y después quería, que lo voy a poner en el chat, quería hacerte una recomendación porque tu presentación me resonó mucho con algunos trabajos que se han estado llevando a cabo acá en Argentina, particularmente el trabajo de Carolina Rosas, que también examina las prácticas de cuidado vecinales de comunidades migrantes en un barrio del área metropolitana de Buenos Aires, así que después lo voy a poner en el chat. Y para Megan, I wanted to ask you if, because I found it very interesting that in a way the dynamics that you saw at the nail salon really like very much were evocative of other kinds of inequalities that these women experience. So I wanted to ask you if there is like, if you in a way like problematize this division between forced migration and labor migration, which I think from what you've described is very clear that this very in a way, very strict distinctions that the nation states make can be problematized through the actual experience of migrants, and in this case of Colombian migrant women, because that is something that when I was doing field work with migrant household workers here in Buenos Aires, I did interview like a few, sorry, not interview, I interacted with a few Colombian women at the NGO that I did my field research with, and they were household workers here, right? But when you you know, like like when you went into a little bit of depth in terms of their life histories, it was very clear that these weren't like quote unquote like labor migrants, that they had been forced out of Colombia in a way. So that is something that that I wanted to ask you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think maybe we can respond.
Okay.
So,
do you want to start yourself with the questions? Yeah, sure.
Thanks so much for the question. And I think that this is very much speaks to this idea of entanglement and kind of breaking down these binaries. And I think this is a context in which, yeah, we very much see the breaking down of this binary of forced and labor migration. The majority of women I work with, as I say, it's kind of sometimes once you get beyond the superficial, where people might be like, oh, I migrated for you know, economic reasons, and you break it down and no, at the bottom of this, it is kind of this violent and insecure context, and sometimes direct acts of physical violence towards them or towards their family members. This is not uncommon at all. But it is only a very few who enter Chile officially seeking asylum, and those are only kind of the most extreme cases. And then I'm sure that as many of you here know, the process to then acquire refugee status is incredibly convoluted and very often unsuccessful. And this is something I hope to kind of unpick more in the book, where I look at the sort of the bureaucracy and how this case really very much confounds that binary. So yeah, thank you very much for the question, and I'd love to talk about it further as well.
So should I on English, right? So look at here. In English. But anyway, so just I'm gonna start for the second question because it's more concrete. Well, yeah, the paper is quite diverse, and so I think difficult to describe, because on one hand you have very important Peruvian population, which is I think the more long settled group of migrants, you know, who are sort of have more kind of organizations of different kinds, either schools for cultural activities, for women, you know, as comités de vivienda, but this also incorporates the rest, I mean, a wide range of migrants, and talk about the other groups as well. So they're also like in this. So I talked about just one organization, right? The other ones was like other sort of dynamics, but there are Ecuadorians, Colombians, and some Chilean people, Brazilians. I think that's the main nationalities that are part of this organization I mentioned at the beginning. But then the other sort of activities or dynamics I describe, I guess, are quite more open, right, to all the possible nationalities. There are some Haitian women and men living there, but I think they are not. I mean, I didn't interview them that much as the other nationalities, I guess, because they are very present arriving migrants. The area is quite expensive as well, so I guess they usually live there kind of transitory shelters that quite discriminate in the different places when they want to rent a place. But also, it's an important group. I think I talk more with them in the context of participant observation more than in that interviews. So that's another group. And then also Venezuelans, there seems to be I think more these are kind of the main groups, right? There are also some North American people living there, like renting. So I think they are sort of a minority, even though they also participate in these activities, right? Like organizing other sort of kind of more yeah, more sort of it's like more asambleas. They can organize assemblies. Those kind of North Americans, European migrants, they participate in those sort of organizations. But yeah, I mean, so it's a wide range of people. I would say it's not really a difference related to nationalities, but also interesting to see, how that relates to different time of residency, non-settling or person arrival migrants, also relate to different age, very young people, kind of older migrants living there. So it's a kind of variety that's quite complex. And the second one voy a poner en español porque es más difícil de realizar en inglés, pero creo que es una muy buena pregunta. Yo no sé si rescaté tanto como las nociones nativas o como que traen consigo de cuidado, porque también a veces ella habla mucho de ideas de apoyo mutuo, ¿no? Hablan de cuidado, pero más que nada para referirse muchas veces al cuidado de los niños, que son cosas que yo no, obviamente están, ¿no? No desarrollé tanto acá, podría haber dicho más de eso. Sí, la idea de que nos cuidamos entre nosotras. Ahora, yo creo que es interesante traer a la mesa cómo hay significados que son culturales del cuidado, ¿no? Como, ¿qué significa cuidar para una mujer haitiana, incluso en el ámbito familiar, ¿no? A su hijo? Es sumamente distinto a lo que es cuidar quizás para en el contexto chileno, ¿no? Este es un tema más que surge bastante en distintas investigaciones. Pero también creo que es interesante cómo hitos y procesos como este reconfiguran lo que se entiende por cuidado. Lo que pasa a ser como más interesante, más importante para ellos, ¿no? Entonces, si bien la pandemia, por ejemplo, una crisis sanitaria, yo no escuché que había una preocupación por el cuidado como mutuo de temas como de salud, ¿no? O sea, lo que pasaba a ser más importante era poder subsistir. Entonces, el cuidado pasa a reconfigurarse también de manera que tiene que ver con prácticas de aprovisionamiento, por un lado, de cuidarse frente a un contexto que se consiga más inseguro, pero el alejamiento de los espacios públicos, y todo aquello imbricado con elementos socioafectivos también, ¿no? Entonces, yo creo que ese es un tema como interesante pensar, ¿no? Quizá, más allá de los significados que traen consigo del cuidado, porque pueden ser muy distintos, cómo esto se reconfigura. Y lo otro respecto de si las fronteras de las personas haitianas parecen más permeables, no tuve como un espacio para ver eso porque no vi como grandes colectivos de personas haitianas. Sí creo que había una diferencia interesante si pensamos en las distintas posiciones de las personas en el barrio, ¿no? Ellos eran usualmente vistos y en las dinámicas que participaban más como sujetos de cuidado, no los vi mucho liderando algún tipo de iniciativa. Obviamente hay elementos asociados en el idioma, en algunos de ellos, pero no yo en español bien, que también probablemente decían participar menos en los chats, ¿no? No sé si son como fronteras, ¿no? Sociales con otros grupos, pero fue interesante para ver algunos límites de la interacción. Sí, yo sentía que había distinciones más con la población venezolana, se veía como mucho más lejana, menos abierta a participar, ¿no? Hay algunas cosas que seguir indagando, ¿no? Como habitantes más transitorios del barrio también, entonces, pero eso, solamente recalcar aquello, ¿no? Y creo que es una buena pregunta, ¿no? Saben mirar si hay significado de cuidado que traigan consigo, así que lo veo como una invitación también a algo a problematizar.
Gracias por las preguntas. No tenemos mucho más tiempo, pero Isabel tiene unas preguntas.
Hola, ¿se escucha bien? Muy buenas tardes. Bueno, agradecer a las dos mujeres que están exponiendo, muy interesantes ambas investigaciones. Tenía unas preguntas en realidad muy relacionadas con lo que Carolina estaba comentando en la última parte, sobre, bueno, emerge esta idea de los cuidados comunitarios también y el cuidarse en colectividad entre estas mujeres del barrio Yungay específicamente, y me preguntaba si es que también existían como consecuencias dentro de sus propios autocuidados, como esta idea de que recaiga todo el cuidado también en las familias y específicamente en las mujeres. Tú lo mencionaste en el último momento también como frente a esta ausencia de cuidados del Estado. Entonces me preguntaba como un poco los dobles riesgos de este extremadamente cuidarnos entre nosotras, que también recae en tiempos de ellas como, y de nosotras como madres, como mujeres, como estudiantes, como profesionales, etcétera. Entonces, cómo esos cuidados comunitarios también un poco merman el propio autocuidado, como que es como para problematizar solamente el término. Y para Megan también, bueno, muchas gracias por tu presentación. Hace un año tuve la oportunidad también de conocer al respecto de las metodologías que estabas implementando. Yo trabajo en Arica y estuve trabajando con mapas corporales con mujeres afrocolombianas y aymara bolivianas también. Súper interesante el tema del mapeo y en particular me acuerdo que hablamos al respecto de los videos que estaban realizando en un contexto de pandemia, que también hemos tenido todas y todos que reconfigurar nuestras metodologías en estos nuevos contextos. Entonces también si tuvieron la oportunidad de ver estos videos las mujeres, conocer al respecto también de estas imágenes que mostraste y cuál fue su reacción, su recibimiento, si es que hubo una oportunidad de devolución con estos materiales. Eso, muchas gracias.
Hola, qué gusto escucharte. Sí, bueno, afortunadamente, justamente hicimos los talleres para el diseño del video animado un mes antes de la pandemia. Así que pudimos hacer esa parte en persona, pero después, claro, la difusión fue en plena pandemia y nos dificultaba un poco conocer de verdad las reacciones de las mujeres. O sea, todos respondieron de manera muy positiva, lo compartieron, etcétera, etcétera, pero como era todo virtual, es un poco más difícil saber en profundidad cómo reaccionaron. Y ahora, bueno, estamos en otro proyecto con varias de las mismas mujeres en que ellas tienen un rol más activo en la producción del arte. Están ellas haciendo artilleras que van a estar en una exposición. Y ha sido un proceso en verdad distinto y muy bonito en que ellas están más involucradas en la producción artística. Y sí, sería un encanto hablar más también sobre cómo salió tu proyecto de mapeo corporal en contexto de pandemia, que sí, claro, ha añadido otro nivel de complejidad. Gracias por la pregunta.
Gracias, Megan. Qué interesante.
Muchas gracias también por la pregunta, creo que es súper importante, ¿no? Como para problematizar esta dinámica. Bueno, y de hecho, pues, como son distintas dinámicas, también hay como distintos actores involucrados, distintas medianas, las distintas dinámicas que mencioné de cuidado, de apoyo mutuo, solidaridad, contención. Entonces, evidentemente hay algunas que son más demandantes del tiempo de las mujeres, ¿no? Y también ahí va cambiando si tienen o no un riesgo. Las dinámicas que se dan cotidianamente a través de la tecnología de interacción, evidentemente demandan menos para ellas. Entonces, ahí probablemente se siente como que hay menos riesgo o menos, hay una mitigación menor, ¿cierto?, del autocuidado en alguna medida, no hay riesgo de contagio, si no estamos en el contexto de la pandemia, y tampoco, de alguna manera, poner como su tiempo, ¿no? El tiempo que podrían dedicar al autocuidado, al ritmo, no se ve tan perturbado, más allá de que algunos dicen, sí, bueno, recibimos muchos mensajes, voy a bloquear este grupo, pero en general no diría yo que tanto. Ahora sí, es interesante pensar, y eso parece, no había elaborado más, no puedo pensar en esta actividad, pero por ejemplo las mujeres que se organizan en cuanto a cuidado, si queremos, tenían muchas actividades de autocuidado antes de la pandemia, ¿no? Hacían mucho deporte, iban a hacer paseos a la playa, cursos para cocinar, o sea, todo ello tenía que ver con lo gregario, ¿no? Y también el autocuidado. Y eso se vio bastante como entorpecido, hubo dificultades para llevarlo a cabo, de hecho es una actividad que están recién retomándose por estos grupos. Entonces, hay una mitigación del autocuidado en ese sentido, ¿ya? Respecto al peso que recae en las mujeres, nuevamente, o sea, sí, sabemos que los cuidados obviamente tienen que ver con la participación mayoritaria de mujeres en el estudio, ¿no? Son mujeres que están mucho más involucradas en la vida vecinal, y bueno, muchas investigaciones en estas temáticas terminan teniendo una muestra con muchas más mujeres por lo mismo, ¿no? También una mujer investigadora en general. Pero sí, yo creo que ahí hay un elemento que es pero más transversal, no creo que sea algo particular de este estudio, ¿no? Que vemos que toman parte de esto en sus hombros. Ahora, sí, las mujeres organizadas que no sé si agregaron muchas más actividades en este contexto de la pandemia de cuidado de las que ya tenía, creo que solamente fueron adaptadas. Pero sí, ciertamente es importante pensar en ello, ¿no? También tiene que ver mucho como con la edad de los niños, creo que también ahí eso impacta un poco cómo esto afecta a nuestro autocuidado, porque, y ahí podemos abrir otra discusión, ¿no? Quienes tienen o no la posibilidad de cuidar, creo que hay muchas mujeres que se involucran menos justamente porque no quieren ver no quieren ver afectado tanto, ¿no? Su salud personal, su desgaste. Cuando hay niños más pequeños, probablemente el involucramiento en estas actividades como un rol de cuidar va a ser mucho menor. Entonces, sí, es un elemento en que profundizar, pero eso es como lo que tengo a primera vista, lo que se ve en el estudio a primera vista, lo que viene a mi mente ahora. Y gracias por la pregunta.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias a todos por asistir. Vamos a tomar unos 5 minutos de break y volvemos para la próxima panel. Ya. Ok, ¿me pongo en modo presentación? Sí, está. Welcome back to the seminar. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second panel, which is called Care Work Between Exploitation and Recognition. And I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Rosario Fernandez, who has a PhD in sociology from Goldsmiths, University of London. She's the lead researcher on the Fondecyt postdoctoral project, The Exercise of Authority in Relations Between Women, Sociological Approximations from the Study of Paid Domestic Work. And this is at the Institute of Advanced Research at the University of Santiago de Chile. She's also assistant professor at the Department of Philosophy, Faculty of Philosophy and Humanities at the Universidad de Chile, the University of Chile. Welcome, and
thank you very much. Thank you all. I'm going to speak in English, but maybe some words, they're going to be in Spanish. Okay, so first of all, I'm not going to focus that much on migration. I did work that on my PhD project, but now because of my new postdoc project, it's much more focused on domestic labor, although still many domestic workers are migrants, so it's still going to be a topic, right? So these are some of the results, and it's a comparative thing about 2 projects, but it also looks back on my thesis in sociology at Goldsmiths. So it's a review about some changes that I've seen and relationships between employers and domestic workers. Okay. Well, in order to understand these transformations, when I did my PhD, I did interviews in 2014, and at that moment we could see some demands and transformations regarding more expectations of having more horizontal and equality-based relationships. Although I think especially with the 2019 estallido social in Chile and with the pandemic, COVID, that these social transformations for more expectations or horizontal and equality-based relationships became a more evident topic in the narratives of the relationships between workers and employers. Okay, I think that's really important. I think we're living in a specific situation in Chile that affect very intimate relationships, and I think that's the first thing that is really super important. Also, because of the question that you made, Megan, about why it's important to understand these intimate spaces, I think they're reflecting also more broader and social, cultural, and economic transformation. So that's one thing that I think is really important. Also, there are new family dynamics, which is a long process in Chile, right? So more women are going outward to the public, are also occupying more authority figures in the public sphere, in the government, at workplaces. But that doesn't mean that the social division of labor has necessarily changed that much. So women are still compelled to perform domestic labor, and maybe they don't do it themselves. They may hire a domestic worker, but still they are in charge of that, right? They have to do all the labor of directing what is happening at home, supervising, and also doing the emotional labor with the children, with the husband, or with partner, and also with domestic workers, right? And today, even though women are using more space and have more expectations of being autonomous and professionally developed, and still there's this idea of, which is a global thing, right? Like intensive mothering, right? So they still are very keen on wanting to have a role at homes, right? This makes a lot of pressure on, especially the women that I focus on is middle and upper class women in Santiago. With this new project, I'm going to do some field work in Concepcion and Valparaíso, but for now I'm just talking about Santiago. So there's a lot of demands, and they feel a lot of pressure, right? On the one hand, being autonomous, using other spaces that they're not used to, but at the same time, they still want to have an important role at homes, right? And so these women, middle and upper class women who have this pressure on them, tend to hire other women to do much of their labor, right? And there's also a big transformation. So if before it was mainly women from the South, you know, so either from rural areas or indigenous, who were seen as ideal nanas, how we call them here in Chile, because of these like rural and indigenous features or stereotypes regarding their submissive, docile attitude. We could see a transformation from the 90s onwards that these women started to be seen as knowing too much about their rights and not assuming their submissive role in the home and asking too much permissions and legal recognition, contracts. So the entrance of Peruvian migrants in Chile became key for trying to to recover this idea of the servant, of this idea of the good nanny, right? However, I think that this population, which was mainly Peruvian, today also know their rights, you know? and they have more knowledge. So even though they're still in a different position than Chilean women, domestic workers, I think today they know about their rights. They are organized. They're more community based. They have their own networks. So today, I think even also Peruvian are being seen as knowing the rights and not being maybe the ideal nanas. And that's why maybe they would go to and look for a Filipino woman, for example, which is what we studied with Carol and the book that we published recently. But there is this like race, ethnicity, and nationality stereotypes regarding this ideal notion of the nana who would be someone who would be willing and devoted and would do it with love and all this labor, right? So we have these interesting transformations. So in this new context, I think for employers, but also for workers, there's a new challenge, right? So how do we deal with the expectation of being more autonomous, of being professional, being more, having more horizontal relations, wanted to be more progressive, more democratic, but we still have learned from our history and their experiences as childs of having domestic workers in their homes and how their mothers and their grandmothers dealt with them in a more hierarchical and exploitative way. How do we today manage this relationship? That's a challenge. That's not something that employers actually really know how to do, and they do have a conflicted relationship on how to manage. And they've seen that a more hierarchical way of doing it that the older generations used to use is not working. But at the same time, trying to be equal, comprehensive is not working as well. So how do we manage this relationship in this new context? So there are generational differences, but also the interviews that I did in 2020, 2021, there's also a before and after the social outbreak and the pandemic, where we can see that there's not only a criticism towards older generations doing a more exploitative manage of the relationship between workers and employers, but also, and the older generations criticizing younger ones, saying that they're being too comprehensive, not knowing the limits, etc. I think now there's a before and after regarding the recognition as well of our own precarity and dependency. So employers are much more expressive than the interviews that I did in 2014 about how they felt in pandemic and with the social outbreak, on how they are dependent as well, and how their own experiences, either as political exiles, as migrants, as women being discriminated at work, also relates to their dependency towards domestic workers. And I think they take it that much more seriously than the narratives in 2014. And that's a topic that I was really intrigued to see, what does that actually mean to recognize your own dependency on workers? Does that mean that we want to be equals? Does that mean that power asymmetries are over? Does that mean that there are new configurations? I'm not sure. I'm just going to try to talk about a few ideas. So first, I think it's really important to say that both in 2014 and after the pandemic and the social outbreak, something really important for these women, for middle and upper class employers, is having a life. And that meant the importance, and it's something that I studied in my thesis, is that domestic workers allow women, middle and upper class women, to have a life. They provide their time, they provide their body, they provide their that everyday presence in order for upper, middle, and upper class women to have a life. And that having a life is very much nurtured by discourses around happiness, around the ideal woman. They very much circulate around the idea of having a happy family with children, with a husband. So in order to have all of this, happy marriage, a big house with jacuzzis and, I don't know, children that do well at school and they're clean and they have a dog and a cat and whatever, they needed these other women, and maybe not only one, but maybe two or three other women that they would hire in order to have this life. Many women would actually, I don't know, give birth, give the child to the nanny so they could sleep with their husband, have a good marriage, not being interrupted, right? So that's, having a life in 2014 was really important, and it still is today. However, in 2014, they were super conscious, and still today, that doesn't mean that hiring a domestic worker is something that is a given and that it would work as a given. So it's so important to do emotional labor with workers, especially if they're migrants, because doing emotional labor many times meant, especially for older generations, doing this tutoring kind of work, right? So they would teach them how they wanted, how children in Chile were criados, were raised, how they like the meals, the seasoning, right? So they would do this kind of work, and actually felt very good, especially older generations, by doing this labor, right? However, older generations, I'm talking about women in their 70s and 80s, were criticized younger generations, saying that they were doing bad emotional labor. And bad emotional labor meant sometimes forgetting or not being clear about the boundaries and trying to bypass power asymmetries. Power asymmetries were, for older generations, really important to be clear and evident. As for younger generations, they, because wanted to assume a more progressive perspective, they wanted to eliminate them. But that apparently wasn't working as well, because it meant that they would feel that their boundaries weren't respected, or that their status or their 5 minutes, okay. Well, yeah, so emotional labor became a key aspect to it, right? So older generations were trying to do this tutoring, more like work that meant being kind to workers, but also showing them how they should do their job and the Chilean ways of doing that. As younger generations were much more keen on trying to understand workers, trying to be comprehensive, okay? But none of these strategies today were actually working, right? Ones were too rigid, or more hierarchical, and the other ones were too messy, too blurry in terms of limits, in terms of differences between them. So in the interviews in 2020, 2021, I could hear in their narratives with much more strength and insistence than in the interviews in 2014, the idea of the respect. So we need to regain respect. And that meant many times regaining boundaries between them, right? So we actually cannot be equal. We actually cannot have radical democratic relationship, but we do need some kind of respect, right? That does not necessarily mean that I respect in terms of the employers. It doesn't mean that they respected workers' differences, right? So, okay, you are, I don't know, from other class, your nationality, or any kind of difference. It doesn't mean necessarily respecting the other as an other, right? It's just that the treatment between each other has to have respect as a core theme, right? And then the idea of recognition became really apparent, but not any kind of recognition. I mean, it was important, the legal normative recognition of workers as workers, right? Because in 2015, we have a new bill in domestic labor that regulates much more the hours of work, the conditions, the contracts, the salaries. It's not perfect, but it was an important advance. So there was that kind of recognition, but it's not what the narratives were trying to, of the employers were trying to put out there. It was much more regarding the recognition of the mutual necessity that they had. So we need each other. We're precarious subjects. Pandemic has let us know that. Social outbreak bring chaos to everyday life, right? So what was being recognized really is not the other as a worker or myself as an employer necessarily, which that it was part, but it wasn't the central, right? What was the center of it was we have a mutual dependency relationship. So, and that recognition, that mutual dependency is also a recognition of I'm also precarious, and it wasn't a feeling or as something that employers felt happy or comfortable with. They did feel conflicted. It was a very effective process. Yeah, 1 minute, I know. So what I think appeared and in many narratives, both in employers and in workers as well, both in migrant and Chilean workers, is that rather than having a more hierarchical relationship or a more comprehensive and trying to be friends or partners, that's something that we did see in the Filipino case with Carol. What they wanted was, because of this recognition of my own precarity, was we need a mutual benefit relationship. Okay, this has to benefit both of us. If it doesn't benefit both of us, it won't work. We're going to start in messy relationships. We're going to start fighting. We're going to lose our limits. So this has to work with us. So this idea of the mutual benefit relationship, for me at least, and this is what I want to bring to discussion, and maybe you would want to discuss it as well, is that rather than an abstract or ideal notion of care and ethics regarding care, I think, and this is, I'm very inspired about Graciela Hierro's work on feminist ethics. She approaches it much more regarding an idea of ethics of Aristoteles, right? So rather than an abstract idea, we see more of the idea of the virtue or the good relationship or the good life in Kant, for example. And Aristotle is much more about the interest. How are my own interests being taken care of? So I think this idea of the mutual dependency and the mutual benefit relationship that workers and employers are trying to manage, and sometimes they do it, they lo logran, a veces no. What I think is bringing us the question about how do we think about care? How do we deconstruct care in a romantic notion of care, that we're going to take care of us, we're going to support us, and rather thinking it in a more practical way and how care can benefit us. It can benefit people that do not want to necessarily erase power asymmetries, which is really difficult, or don't know how to because it's a more structural way. But in the intimate relationship at homes, they do want to think about, in practical terms, how does this benefit each other, and how is that also a way maybe of caring about each other? Yeah, I'm just going to leave it there. Maybe we can have more time in the Q&A.
I'm now very pleased to introduce Nazli Gomez, who has a degree in history with a mention in political science from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Valparaíso, and an MA in Southeast Asian Studies from the National University of Singapore. And she's going to be presenting a paper that she has written with Dr. Carol Chan. Do you want me to do that? Yeah, can you please? So when you're ready.
Yeah, please start. Okay, good afternoon. Our presentation is titled Institutional and Cultural Challenges to Addressing Migrant Labor Exploitation in Chile. In 2011, 2 Indonesian women escaped from a house in Punta Arenas where they worked as living domestic workers. Soon after, they helped a 3rd woman escape from another household. Sorry, I got the ball. I keep talking. Their employers were all related, they had brought the women via recruitment agencies in Indonesia and Singapore. They were promised wages and good working conditions, but they found themselves working long hours with no rest days or vacations. They weren't adequately fed nor clothed to withstand the harsh winters in the south. They suffered verbal and psychological abuse and were not allowed to leave the house nor to communicate with their families. This extreme isolation, along with the fact that they were never paid, led to their escape. Eventually, they filed a lawsuit against their employers, Pishu Lakwani and Monica Nangwani, for the crime of human trafficking into forced labor. During the investigation, a fourth Indonesian woman also escaped and testified to living and working in similar abject conditions under another employer also related to the aforementioned employers. Many witnesses corroborated their testimonies, while others refused to testify out of fear. Despite all this, the case was closed in 2012, citing insufficient evidence. In 2017, the case was reopened to include evidence that one of the women was a minor when she arrived in Chile. The woman received the formal support of the Institute of Human Rights. Diverse actors involved claimed either that this was a textbook case of human trafficking where all facts were corroborated, or that there was insufficient evidence. While the case was ongoing, a fifth Indonesian woman escaped from the house of a person previously accused of trafficking in 2011.
Natalie, I think you should sit because the microphone is here and the Zoom keeps, this is for the interpreter. So it would just be, I'm just concerned for the Zoom. Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
In the end, none of these cases were ever formally prosecuted by legal authorities. Next, please. Their experiences, however, are not isolated. While conducting interviews with Indonesian women in Santiago and Iquique, we encountered very similar stories of extreme labor exploitation. Not only the means by which they came to the country were similar, direct hiring, but they were also not allowed to leave the houses and didn't receive their wages. Out of the 29 women we interviewed, at least 10 tried to report their situations to the authorities. Next one, please. Chile officially implemented an Anti-Human Trafficking Act in 2011. Since then, the government has prosecuted 20 cases of human trafficking into forced labor. 10 received a guilty verdict, while the other 10 were absolved, closed, or prosecuted under a different crime. The majority of cases were never formally investigated due to insufficient evidence. Thus, labor trafficking in Chile remains a relatively invisible crime. We interviewed 27 people, including trafficking victims, lawyers, prosecutors, as well as Indonesian and Chilean state actors. We also analyzed legal documents and conducted fieldwork in the cities the women migrated to in order to trace the development of the legal processes and the ways of understanding human trafficking into forced labor. The definition of human trafficking comes from the Palermo Protocol signed in the year 2000. However, this definition is implemented in diverse ways. It varies depending on each country and their respective juridical and national contexts. In our research, we use the concept of legal culture, defined as the social study of law or social forces that shape and influence how the law operates in real life. In other words, we examine the legal culture in Chile, the law in action, to see how it understands and applies the Palermo Protocol in cases of labor trafficking. We argue that these four aspects of Chilean legal culture strongly shape how anti-trafficking laws are enforced and act as obstacles when it comes to identifying and preventing labor trafficking in Chile. With regards to the first aspect, When the anti-human trafficking law was implemented in 2011, forced labor became a crime that could be prosecuted and punished by the law for the first time. Unlike other countries where forced labor is a crime in and of itself. But this was preceded by an intense debate in Congress regarding which term to use, labor exploitation or forced labor. Deputies initially settled for the term labor exploitation, but upon discussion in the Senate, it was changed to forced labor, because according to a senator, a labor law violation does not constitute trafficking. The issue is that the public ministry turned this reasoning into a sort of filter, where, as one of our interviewees states, one would see labor law violations, so that means it's not trafficking into forced labor. With regards to the heterogeneous understandings of forced labor, one of the main challenges is the high evidentiary standards required in Chile to prosecute labor trafficking, but also the fact that even though the ILO provides 11 indicators to help identify forced labor, prosecutors and judges use their discretionary powers to select which indicator, if any, to rely on, since there is no standard or official definition of forced labor. And most of the time, the cases they prosecute are the more extreme ones, where the evidence speaks for itself. But this is not a common occurrence when it comes to forced labor. Yeah. Other factors that explain why understandings are so diverse are the relative novelty of the law, as mentioned before, the discretionality of certain actors, but also anti-trafficking campaigns that reproduce stereotypes about the victims. The social construction of victimhood strongly influences how key stakeholders approach the construction of victim during trials and legal investigations of trafficking cases. Studies have shown that if victims do not fit the image of the ideal victim, exemplified by the child sex slave, state authorities might not perceive or identify trafficking where workers, labor advocates, and activists do. This quote refers to the stereotype that surrounds victims of forced labor, that they are not necessarily in shackles, right? But under more sophisticated systems of control. Prosecutors and lawyers interviewed agreed that in Chile, the more humiliation suffered by the victim, the better chances a labor trafficking case has in court. Another interviewee stated more boldly, for labor exploitation to be perceived as labor trafficking, it has to be similar to torture. This indicates a normalization of labor abuses, such as excessive hours, low pay, and psychological and verbal abuse by employers. The complexity in convicting cases of labor trafficking due to normalization of migrant labor exploitation is evident in a case in 2020, where 2 accused traffickers were absolved of the crime of smuggling and trafficking. As stated by the judges, this was because the situation of the victim does not deviate too much from the vulnerable situation of many migrants who enter the country and are exposed to working in extreme conditions. This quote expands a bit more on the normalization of exploitation and how this affects our ability to detect trafficking. As you can observe, they mention that we have naturalized violence and domination within our societies, so that makes it difficult to detect abuses. The fourth and final aspect of Chilean legal culture is the lack of coordination between relevant institutions. prosecutors bear most of the responsibility when it comes to cases of trafficking. It's a huge risk for them because not only are they in charge of the legal investigation, they also have to present the case before the court, and trials are long, during which they have to provide protection and assistance to the victims. If they lose the case, the prosecutor's office must pay for the cost of the trial. As a result, this makes it difficult for other institutions to intervene and cooperate. This is a quote by a lawyer of one of the Indonesian women in Punta Arenas, where he...
Sorry, this is a quote by the judge in the appeal. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, yeah, you're right. Sorry, it's the judge. By one of the judges in the appeal case, where he criticizes the lack of objectivity shown by the prosecutor leading the investigation, because she wanted to close the case without completing the investigative process. Discussions about the line between forced labor and labor violations risk losing sight of the value of anti-trafficking laws and the role of the justice system in the first place, which is to ensure a certain level of human dignity and integrity. We end our presentation with a couple of recommendations, which are mainly to develop a shared understanding and definition of forced labor. We encourage the specialized training and education to key stakeholders and improve institutional collaboration, among others. Thank you very much.
Now we would like to invite questions from the audience, and maybe Rosario can accompany us here. There's another, we can accept questions from the audience or here with us or online. Let's see if we've got any. Any questions from the audience? That's Maria. Yeah, you were right during that. Yeah, I'm fine. Sorry. Yeah, Maria, and then one more question. Maybe we'll have the live question first. You want to ask your question? Yeah. One second while we just get you.
Carol, ¿voy yo primero o va la compañera?
Claro, espera un poco.
Ok.
Gracias.
Gracias por la presentación. Quería una precisión conceptual. Todo lo que es posible, no me la pregunta. Pero sí hay una diferencia, porque como Nicole hablaba de trabajo emocional y afectivo, y tú hablas de trabajo emocional, como qué diferencia lo puede explicar a las compañeras y el trabajo que ustedes realizan respecto al tráfico de personas de una relación con el sector agrícola, y es está relacionado con los monocultivos.
¿Con el qué cultivo?
Monocultivo. El que yo estudio revolución social y cadenas globales de mercancía, la industria chilena, y hay una relación muy directa de cómo la violencia estructural, específicamente hacia las mujeres, está muy relacionada con el extractivismo en Chile. Eso es monocultivo.
Monocultivo. No. Y otra pregunta.
You want to take part?
No. Espera. Dale, María Liz.
Bueno, primero agradecerles y felicitarlas por sus excelentes exposiciones. Mi pregunta era para Rosario. Lo que quería preguntarte es si esta cuestión de la dependencia mutua y del beneficio mutuo en la relación entre trabajadoras y empleadoras es algo que notaste en tu investigación a la hora de negociar los derechos laborales. La razón por la cual te pregunto esto es porque yo en mi trabajo de campo con trabajadoras de casas particulares acá en Argentina, lo que noté es que a la hora de básicamente argumentar por qué las empleadoras tenían que reconocer sus derechos laborales, no entraba tanto un discurso, si bien ellas estaban familiarizadas y sabían sobre sus derechos laborales, pero a la hora de contarme, o sea, por qué ellas creían que la empleadora tenía, por ejemplo, que registrar la relación o pagarle las vacaciones o darle el día libre, el discurso que ellas utilizaban era un discurso más bien de reciprocidad, y de esto que vos decís, o sea, de reconocimiento del beneficio mutuo en la relación, es decir, por ejemplo, ellas decían cosas como, bueno, yo soy muy buena con la mamá, entonces me tiene que poner en blanco, como se dice acá coloquialmente, a registrar la relación laboral. O sea, el discurso era, no es me tiene que registrar porque es mi derecho como trabajadora, sino me tiene que registrar porque yo soy buena con los hijos o soy buena con la mamá. Entonces, quería preguntarte si quizás, o sea, es algo que vos también encontraste en tu propia investigación. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much for those questions. In relation to the difference between the emotional labor and affective labor, right? So I think it's very complicated in the case of affective labor to because of separate things. But if we must make the distinction, I think it's an important one. I think emotional labor, for me, agricultural work has been super important to understand. All the work that has to be done to produce emotion and the rules about that. So domestic worker, when enters in her house, and especially when she has to live in the house where she works, she has to learn the rules, not only of the house, of the country, of the country, it has to do with how to produce emotion, how to produce wellness in the sense of home, in the sense of eso rico, cuando llegas a la casa y hay olor rico. That is emotional labor that is tackled with cultural and social norms regarding the home, regarding what it means to take care of children, to take care of employers. So, and that is, it has the ethical aspect of it, a performative aspect, right? So it has to be seen as well, individuality and materiality really evident in the thing. And you have to act for it and act it as if you're not acting. So that's the danger thing, and that Ali Bush thought about, like that deep acting of emotional labor, right? So the worker has to do this emotional labor, doesn't even know sometimes when the person is acting or when the person even the workers can get confused, right? And so that what they are expected to act are themselves, subjectivity. I think looks at this in the service sector, and other authors have looked at it. So another part, like Heidi May, we have also got like how emotions have been part of, are now part of the new world system of labor, right? That's been sold, the production of value, a discussion that is way before in the feminist and gender studies, right? How do we produce value? How do we produce mercancía? Is that an object? Is that an emotion? Is that a well-being? That's a long discussion, right? So now, and new transformations of labor relationships. Today, when you go and buy something, you also want to feel good when you go buy, I don't know, clothes so it's very much being extended to more other debates about labor in general. And I think effective relationship, at least for me, is important, especially in domestic labor, because affects don't always. And that, I think, I assume more is Smithsonian or idea of affect. But always respond to all the cultural definitions of emotion. Sometimes it can be very complex and comprehensive and not regulated. And that many times they're felt rather than
So it has a bit of a difference with Article styles work that assumes a more rational subject to act and does the emotional labor. The idea of affective labor is something that you don't necessarily rationally produce it, right? So something that helps in a relationship, affects circulate, right? So they affect each other. So how, for example, the bad event stories in around mood in the morning, how does that affect workers? Okay? Oh, how do, or things discuss even the need of to vomit, for example, because you're seeing somebody else's voice. How that transmission of affect shows social power, social power symmetry within the home, for example. So I think we have to read them together. But for me, it allows me to see that also that just unconscious and not necessarily evident ways in which power relationships are produced in these more sensorial, sensoriales, right? And then also the historical aspect of transmission of certain aspects, such as discuss. And yeah, in terms of my question, I think that in my interviews, it was very difficult to distinguish between a conversation about social, about the work contract and the intimate relationship. It was because my studies around the relationship between employers and workers that live in the house.
Disculpame, Rosario, pero no te escucho casi nada, no se entiende casi nada. ¿Podrías acercarte al micrófono?
Ya. Que te decía que en el fondo, en el estudio que yo hago, como son con mujeres trabajadoras que viven con las empleadoras, es complicado a veces separar esas conversaciones. O sea, se pueden estar tomando un té y hablando sobre la sobrina y después pueden hablar sobre el contrato, ¿no? Como está muy mezclado y a veces los discursos más basados en el beneficio mutuo sirven para un objetivo o para otro, y eso no significa que no también existan a la vez, simultáneamente, discursos de, bueno, pero es tu trabajo, o es para esto te pago, o si no, mejor te vas, o sea, igual no persisten. Lo que pasa es que la diferencia, yo creo que más notoria para mí al menos, fue que no apareció tanto, con tanta presencia esta idea del beneficio mutuo antes, hace, no sé, 7 años, 8 años atrás. Ahora parece mucho más potente. En Chile tampoco tenemos una cultura tan protectora de los derechos de los trabajadores como en comparación con la Argentina, me parece, por ejemplo, que sí es un discurso mucho más validado y que incluso la clase media y alta también la ha incorporado como parte de su proceso de modernización, ¿no? Como sentirse clase moderna o sentirse... creo que ahí hay algunos trabajos bonitos en Argentina de cómo muestran que la modernización del discurso de los empleadores también tiene que ver con una cuestión cultural del país, ¿no? Yo creo que en Chile ser modernos o ser todavía no está muy ligado a los discursos de derecho, encuentro yo todavía. O sea, hoy más con el estallido social, pero en realidad no me parece que sea significativamente importante como si lo es en Argentina, ¿no? Eso, no sé si entendí bien la pregunta, pero eso quería comentar.
Sí, la respondiste, es súper interesante, muchísimas gracias.
Gracias a ti.
O sea, la parte del sector agrícola lo vimos a través de las sentencias que analizamos, pero no lo estudiamos realmente. Nos enfocamos en el caso de las mujeres como asesoras del hogar que tuvieron esos problemas. Sí, pero hay casos como súper notarios, como el caso paraguayo o caso Fractal. Hay una discusión también donde the accused were not convicted because the judges thought it was a crime, it should be a crime against humanity. So there was a misinterpretation. So they said that was horrible what happened to them, it was terrible, it was morally reprehensible, but it is not trafficking because trafficking is defined as a crime against humanity. And then later, a prosecutor, fiscal, she wrote a paper saying that that was a mistake. And this case also shows us more broadly, beyond the case of domestic work, right? In general, forced labor is misunderstood even by the judges in such an extreme way. And so it also contributes to our argument that we also drew on this case as part of the references for our argument that there is not a shared understanding of what is forced labor or what is human trafficking. That can be explained also by the campaigns about that influence even judges this idea of what is trafficking, right? This idea of the ideal victim comes into play. But definitely, according to the statistics, a lot of men are victims, and this is because of the cases they're involved in, which is in generally agriculture. You're absolutely right. That's very important. Yeah. Thank you very much. I think maybe if there are no more questions, we can now invite Nicole to give some concluding remarks. Thank you, Megan.
I have an impossible task. I think, yeah. First, I just want to thank you again for excellent papers, both yesterday and today. And beginning with yesterday's keynote speaker, whose talk I really envy because it's so organized and meticulous that we can fit a lot of what we talked about throughout the last 2 days into various parts of that format. And whereas that presentation, I think, is incredibly neat and tidy and organized, I feel like she should probably be ending it because mine is going to be messing up all these categories and seeing the entanglements, the blurs, the impossible knots for us to untie. And so I think we've been left with so many imponderables and questions that we don't have the answers to. I mean, we're talking about emergent situations in which we're just struggling to make sense of how to resolve problems that are so deeply and fundamentally entangled with power differences and inequalities and cross-cultural ideas about what people want, as well as, and this is the part that I find so fascinating, is that it's not just some contractual notion of giving and receiving care, but it's also arguing and digging into what it means to have self-care, what it means to produce affect in other people, and the sort of minutia of things that are fluid by definition. You know, whether 1 second I feel uncared for and the next second I feel warm and fuzzy and well taken care of, it's stuff that's very difficult to get at through the concepts that we use. That's why I'm fascinated with some of the artistic concepts that try to produce it and talk about it in a way that's sort of fluid and gets at the constant transformation of it. But that very fluidity and entanglement is what doesn't sit well with legal concepts of, trafficking and labor contracts and employment agreements, because those are, we try to define them in black and white, whereas the real desire on the emotional side is to be comfortable with your employee or your employer or the person you're living with as your caregiver, who also receives care from you, which I had forgotten about in a lot of my work, so I really appreciate thinking about that. But then we also see how historically it's almost like we're going around in circles. It's so interesting in the historical examples we've seen here. And so what I'm reminded of is the sort of Western feminist illusion of sisterhood and of equality, that of course it's a great idea and we all want that, but is that what the migrant worker from some other place wants, or does she just want to do the job and go home and have a life as well? And so to me, and I have to try to be more open-minded about it because it's so seductive in a sense, is, the idea of, the domestic worker will allow you to have a life, but at what cost to her? Is she having a life, or is she putting her life on hold? Or is she gritting her teeth and trying to be who you want her to be, while she would rather be home with her own kids and would do anything to exchange her life with yours, and so I'm reminded of conversations that I had long ago with Filipino workers who would tell me stories about how their employer would say, "You're my best friend, you're the only one I can talk to about my husband's infidelity or about his other wife," or things like that. And the domestic worker would be telling me the story and kind of rolling her eyes, saying and I just have to sit there and listen to her and act like I care, and so not everything is that cynical, I know, but it's the idea of trying to understand the other side, and trying to understand what each wants and needs is so one-sided for us as academics to be talking about that, even, without having them, it's that us, them, and we are all probably caregivers, caretakers. Most of us are migrants or mobile people in one way or another, but always to be, this is an exercise in humility, because I think we've all heard about other perspectives, or those other perspectives are kind of trying to creep in and remind us it's not the only one. So I want to say I'm really humbled and embarrassed at not speaking Spanish and being here speaking with you, because I have so much to learn, and I've learned so much, despite the trying to listen very carefully to what you're all saying. But the same questions nag at me about sort of ideas about consent, about forced labor exploitation, when I personally think all labor is exploitation. So where do you draw the line between the degree of exploitation that makes it wrong, as opposed to all of it being fundamentally and morally wrong? But on a more practical level, though, I think that to me, it's very interesting how our language to analyze this has shifted from one of power, resistance, and agency to more complex and subtle ideas that allow for more fluidity and nuance when we're talking about care. And I think that's both the strength of the concept of care, is that it allows us to see all the different ways that it can be expressed, questioned, directions it comes from and goes to, as well as, you know, it's something that you can manipulate and use. But fundamentally, power keeps coming back in, and inequality keeps coming back in. And I think thinking of it as an interaction, an interactive and an emergent process is what I get out of the papers as a whole. But one concept that people kept bringing up is the psychological issue, the emotional issue. And that one is both intriguing and troubling, because cross-culturally, I think in many different communities, there are such different associations with, you know, is it just a regular emotion, or is it mental illness, or is it, does it define you as somehow deviant, or does it define you as, you know, an other because of these different practices or emotional understanding? So, you know, even sadness, depression, that we can talk about them across all these different groups of people, and we can say, well, we're talking about migrants and mobile people, but even among them, there are such differences, and in different cultures, so many different ways to see them. So I was thinking, it's so ironic to me that in Chile, Filipinas are considered ideal domestic workers because they make good nanas because they're not too assertive. Whereas the whole point in Hong Kong was, in the history there, was that Filipinos were too assertive, too activist, too aware of their rights. And so they were replaced gradually by a lot of employers, by Indonesians, who were seen as less educated, more passive, less knowledgeable of their rights, unable to communicate as well. So you could get a lot out of them and pay them less, even illegally. So there's some parts of this that are so contextual, and some parts that feel like history repeating itself in different contexts. But I kept thinking, some questions I thought about were, and this is perhaps the biggest takeaway point that I have, is I think that not thinking of migrants as migrants and citizens as citizens, or insiders and outsiders, but trying to think about what they share, where they interact, and what they have in common. Because I do think that the problems are made worse by thinking of people as migrants versus citizens. And because there are so many different kinds of migrants and so many different kinds of citizens. And I think it benefits only the state or the government or the organizations that make money off of that distinction. It benefits them more than it benefits the migrants and the citizens to have that divide. So if we think about what, and this is where I think Carolina's, from what I could follow of it, was useful, is that you're talking about all different kinds of migrants who have come at different times and interact with one another. So what does it even matter that they're migrants? It's more people who are helping each other in different ways, all have certain needs or had them at certain times for housing, for food, for companionship, for their children's education, for health and all that. And so thinking of not just the citizens who are, and this is the other part, that sort of people who legitimately are entitled to support versus those who are illegitimate and don't deserve it. That's where the citizen migrant thing tends to reinforce a notion of the deserving and the undeserving, and then it becomes the state doesn't need to do anything for people who are undeserving, whereas everyone's deserving, and many of their needs are similar to those of people who are citizens who may also be poor or not have ideal housing or not have ideal healthcare or not have ideal education. So that division, I think, tends to often do more harm than good. It's good to think with, but it's not necessarily good for the overall picture, I think. So I know I'm rambling a lot, and I can say, oh, well, it's just all entangled. And I'll leave it at that and leave it to everyone to work on these different entanglements, which I think each piece has been just fascinating to think about. And if I had a few more days to think, I could come up with something much better to end with. But thank you all very, very much.